everyone, my name is Zoe. I'm the Head of Content at LanguageNet, and welcome to our webinar on surviving or even thriving in Ofsted Deep Dive. This webinar is for our colleagues in secondary schools in MFL, and this is our speaker Elaine. She'll be joining us in a few moments. We also have one coming up next, 2 weeks time for our primary colleagues. So if you're here and you're a primary teacher, you're welcome to stay, but the next webinar will be really aimed at you. You can find that on Eventbrite. If you follow our Twitter page as well, you will see the link to that. And this webinar will be recorded, so if you have colleagues who weren't able to make today, you think it's really interesting and useful for them, they will be able to access this. We'll be sending out, and it will be available on our website hopefully very soon. We'll be starting just a moment or two, just giving everyone a minute to get their cup of tea, recuperate from the end of school, just get themselves settled in. While we're waiting, please do say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're from and what your role is, because it's really helpful for us to know. Is it primarily heads of departments or heads of faculty, head teachers, sort of teachers as well? I can see we've got lots of heads of department, for example, but we have some people who are just teachers, obviously. And I'll be introducing my colleague Elaine. She has so much experience on both sides of the fence. So she has been Ofsteded and she has worked with Ofsted. So she really does know what she's talking about when it comes to Ofsted deep dives. And she's done many deep dives herself, been on the receiving end as well as on the inspecting end. And she's also got a wealth of experience working as an advanced skills teacher, writing resources, and being the director of MFL for a trust. So I think I'm going to pass over to Elaine, and if you have any questions, please do write them in the Q&A chat, and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. So passing over to Elaine now. Hello.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you, Zoe. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first of our webinars in this new academic year. As Zoe said, I do have a lot of experience. I never call myself an expert because I'm always learning something new, but I do have a lot of experience with working alongside staff as part of looking at their MFL areas and helping them to improve, and also to look at where they might have gaps to be able to actually fill those gaps. It's a session tonight looking primarily, if not totally, at secondary. We're going to have a look at what might a deep dive look like, tips on how you might prepare for one, and also looking at some possible answers to some questions that you may be asked. There will be a little bit of overlap in terms of how you might prepare and questions, and I don't make any apology of that in tonight's preparation for this session, because a lot of this is interleaved anyway. I've tried to give you some insights into some of the Ofsted jargon that you may well find might be useful in a conversation with an inspector. And I think it's important to understand that if your school has got any particular way of marking or teaching or doing assessments or anything, that all the time you need to think carefully about how you talk to an inspector, because obviously you want to give your department and your school in the best light during an inspection. This is not about what you have to do, this is about what you might do. And take from this what you feel is useful for you and change it, amend it, disregard it if you feel that it's not for you and your school. In preparation for this, I've obviously got a lot of experience in nearly 33 years in the classroom, and I'm still teaching, even though it's a lot less these days. Now I work with LanguageNet, but I've certainly had many conversations in the last 6 to 8 weeks with colleagues that I've worked with, colleagues that I'm currently working with, and also colleagues that I don't work with, in particular along the lines of social media and Twitter. I think we would all agree that the MFL community is very good at sharing and collaborating and giving ideas. So there are a lot of people tonight who've had an input into this session and given me lots of information that I can pass on to you, the attendees at tonight's session. Obviously, we are part of the language community, even though we do have a resource. We have a real sort of interest in supporting all our colleagues, whether you subscribe to LanguageNet or not. And I think that we work alongside lots of different organisations, one of whom is the Association for Language Learning, DLL, and Helen Myers, who took part in our Question Time MFL event in June, also ran a training session a couple of weeks ago, which I attended, and I'm grateful to Helen for her support with that meeting that she ran for ALL, and also some of the ideas that she had in her session you will see in tonight's session. So thank you to Helen for that, as well as anybody else who I've missed off in terms of people I've spoken about and we'll talk about tonight who've given us ideas. So the reason we're doing this then is, as I said, it's become apparent that, you know, the whole of the country is really Ofsted weary, but as teachers and heads of department, in fact, whatever role you've got in schools, we're not Ofsted weary. We still have to get on with it, and we're still in the heart of what's going on. And so stress levels are very high in the teaching profession, as they are in a lot of other professions, but particularly with the fact that we're now back in the classroom full time, and we've all got colleagues, I'm sure, who are off sick, and who are children who are off as well with COVID or self-isolating. And there was results of a questionnaire that came out today said that the teachers that had been asked, 78% of them said that work-life balance was poor. So if we can support you with that, because we know that an inspection is very stressful, if we can support you with giving you some help and information to that, then we feel that we are giving you as much as we can from tonight's session. If there are any resources from tonight that you would like to have, then please email me. My email's on the last slide, but it's elaine@languagenut.com, and you'll be able to get any information or resources or have a chat or anything that you want after tonight's session. So the purpose of a deep dive that you will have will be for you to show off your department, even though you might not think it is, that you are part of another sort of 2 or 3 other departments that will be involved in being given a deep dive for your school, and they're really looking at getting a flavour of your department. So it's a big onus if you are head of department to explain how your MFL is taught, your rationale for it, how you're implementing it, and what your impact is on that. So really, we hope tonight you'll be able to get some ideas that will help you get caught in rather than not caught out. But it's really important to understand that what they will see, hear and read is what they will take away and write a report about, or they will talk about in the inspection report. So what they will see in classrooms, what they will see teachers doing and pupils doing, what they'll see in your books, in classwork and homework, what they'll see on the walls, anything that you've got on your website. What they'll hear in pupil voice and in the classroom, what the pupils are saying to each other, if an inspector speaks to them in the classroom, what they hear from that kind of an answer, and also what they hear the teacher saying, and obviously what they will read by looking at maybe in books, and also you know, you might have done a pupil voice, or there might even been a parental voice, and what they will read on that, if there is anything there that's said about your department. So evidence is not something that you'll have to take to an inspector these days. They very rarely ask, in the experience that I've seen and spoken to people about, they very rarely ask to see documentation. It's mostly picking up what they can see, hear and read around them as they go through the 2-day inspection. I think I needed to just quickly mention something about the current situation with regard to languages, because that's ever changing, as we all know. Amanda Spielman has asked a lot of departments to have a curriculum research review done, and if you're not aware of this, I suggest you get a hold of a copy of this, because it's really interesting reading. The one for languages was published in June, and it's broken down into sections, and basically at the end of each section there's a list of bullet points which indicate what high quality language education may look like. It may have the following features, and speaking to a couple of colleagues over the last month or so, there have been some inspections done where an inspector has come to the language department with a copy of this in his hand or her hand and has said, well, this is what you are supposed to be doing, this is what you should be doing. In actual fact, you will have the right to turn around and say, actually, it doesn't say that, it says may have the following features. So I just wanted to sort of flag that up with you tonight. The new GCSE proposals, as we know, have been backwards and forwards, a bit like ping pong, although there hasn't been much coming out of the DFE and Ofqual. But even as late as last week, on the 25th of November, 8 organisations, including all the exam boards, ALL, and lots of other organisations that are involved, have got an interest in teaching languages, have all put this letter together, and again, by clicking on this response, we can see what that looks like, and you may be able to see it, probably not, but that response is in there. If you wanted to see what it looked like, you can have a copy of this slide and you will be able to look at that. The Ofsted framework, however, is something which we're all faced with, and basically what we have here is a paragraph that sits in the actual EIF document, the Education Inspection Framework, and it states categorically that the government's ambition, it's not a target, it's an ambition, that all of the schools will have, and this will affect our current year 9 and year 6. So again, that's something which obviously the inspection framework is clearly keen to look at when they come in to do a deep dive, because it's actually in the framework. Oh, sorry about that. It's important to know that there is no sort of single way of doing teaching a high quality curriculum, and that is actually in the introduction of the actual research review. And again, I've reiterated there, with the high quality language learning may have the following features. And I know that when the ALL did their session a few weeks ago, it was reiterated very strongly about the fact that HMI had actually rubber stamped that and said that it is correct to say may have and not should have, and that's why I just wanted to put this in tonight. Again, thanks to members of the ALL and Helen Myers and quite a few other colleagues who've supported me with this training tonight. So what might a deep dive look like? I'm just conscious of the time. No experience is really the same, and so there's no single way of doing this inspection. So there is no definitive answer, and that's why I've used might in this. And you think, well, why bother putting this session on tonight? Well, as I said before, it's so important that we can give you as much information as I can in one place, because I've got the time to do that in my job, and that's part of my role, so that you can then sort of cherry pick, ignore, do whatever you feel you want to take from this session tonight. It will obviously look very different if you have a linguist inspecting your team rather than a non-linguist, and you will definitely feel like you've got a second shadow. It is very rigorous, and you will feel it's very intense. You will feel as if you're being followed all the time by this inspector for a certain amount of time during the two-day window. On average, the meeting that you will have if you are in charge of languages or if you are a lead for your school is around 30 minutes. The last deep dive that I did, I requested the last couple of minutes that I was involved in. I requested the last couple of minutes of my lesson to be covered, even if it just meant that a senior leadership team came down and stood in the doorway, just so that I could actually get to the room where the meeting was on time. And then I had the amount of time that I could talk to the person and tell them everything that I wanted, because you don't want to try and you want to try and give them the maximum time, hopefully, that they've given you. They will often interrupt you and move on, so don't worry. Don't take it personally if that happens, and don't think that you're giving a wrong or a right answer, because there are no wrong and right answers, and don't think they're doing that on purpose. It's just that they've got to really push on and get through what they need to do in the limited time that they have as well. But they will certainly speak to the head of department or the person in charge, and they will also talk to the rest of the team separately from the member of staff in the head of department, to sort of look and listen to see whether what you're saying is what the rest of the team are saying. They may well speak to teaching assistants, and if you have them, foreign language assistants. So again, it's important that they know what's going on in your department. A key topic for discussion for you will be the national curriculum and your scheme of work. But again, I can't I can't reiterate enough, there is no Ofsted favoured way of doing things, and there is no one type of pedagogy. Unless, of course, as I said earlier, your school has its own and you have to follow that, then that is a different kind of conversation that you may well have to have with an Ofsted inspector. But you're definitely not being judged by the Ofsted Research Review, you're being judged by the national curriculum and your delivery of that for Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, obviously GCSE criteria, and also the EIF. There will be several lessons observed if you're in for a deep dive. You might not get seen if you don't have a deep dive. You might never get seen by an inspector, even though you've prepared everything, if your subject is not on that list. There will be some joint observations with maybe if you're a normal teacher with your subject lead, head of department with the SLT person who looks after your department, who oversees it, maybe your line manager, and they will normally see everyone and sometimes more than once. And I remember last year there were quite a few one-man band departments that I was working with, and they really were under the cosh for being observed 4 or 5 times. The length of observations can vary. I've known an observation be just 5 minutes when they've just popped in to see someone, and then it could be the length of the lesson that you have. Obviously, they will change depending on which school you work in. They will talk to the students in the lesson, so it's really important that you think carefully about where your spare seats are. This will change, I think, as guidance goes through with COVID, now that masks are back on. I'm not sure how that's working at the moment, and I can't say I can definitely give you even the slightest bit of my sort of knowledge of that, because it will vary as to how that would work out in a classroom. There will be a scrutiny of work, and that has been, in every case that I've spoken to people or been involved myself, it's been a joint scrutiny of the work between the inspector and the teacher, as in the lead for MFL. Mostly it will be books of the pupils that they have chosen to be part of the pupil voice. It could well be that you get a really interesting inspection phone call on the first day that says, we're not really bothered which books we see or which pupils we see, just give us a list of students and we'll look at the books. If you're lucky enough for that to be the case, then you can obviously present the books that you feel are the best books in terms of presentation. And obviously, if your school have a particular way of marking in purple pen, or you use stickers or stampers, or what when well even better if, or all the different types of marking that there are out there, then you will obviously need to adhere to that. Otherwise, you could well let the side down, and that you don't want to be in that position. But obviously, if you're not, then it doesn't really matter how you mark, as long as you've got a justification for doing it. They do actually look at how misconceptions are addressed in classwork in the lesson, and they may well take photographs of pupils' work to sort of think about and just jog their memories when they're writing the reports. One of the things I've always done when I've been doing a work scrutiny, especially when I've been doing it with younger teachers or with teachers who I'm doing a performance management of, is I've sat down with them and I've said, right, let's look at your books together. And this is an example of something that you could do. You may well feel that you don't want to, but it's just to give you some sort of an idea of how it could work, is that you actually take charge of that work scrutiny. And to be honest with you, if it's a linguist that's doing, if it's a non-linguist that's doing the inspection for your department, then they might feel grateful of that. They won't say that to you, obviously, but you can actually then showcase and talk them through what you're actually doing, what's been done, why and how. And if it's the books that have been seen from a lesson that's also been seen, so it's a lesson that's observed and it's books that's been looked at, then you've got a great opportunity there to sort of showcase what you've actually done and why you've done it and how you've done it. And again, I've dropped in there things that they're looking at the phonics. Obviously memorization and learning more and remembering more is key. And if you've got some assessments that are easy to hand, they're obviously not that great looking at data at the moment, because in most of I don't think I've come across any member of staff that I've spoken to, including in the last week, that I've had a deep dive that have not shown data. They've not been interested. They've been interested in assessments, and they've been interested in looking at assessments to see what's been done after an assessment and how the learning and the teaching has been adapted following that. But if you can be confident showing your books on what your pupils can achieve, then you can take ownership of that conversation, and they are going to make their own assumptions if you don't guide them through it. Personal learning checklist is something that I've used all throughout my career, and they've been in and out of fashion for many sort of, as everything comes in out of fashion with teaching, they are not on here to say, oh, you've got to have one of these, otherwise you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. That's completely not why they're on that list. They're on there because I wanted to talk to you about how I've used them, because they've been useful for me to show the previous knowledge that a child has done, and also how that was reviewed later on. And it's been really useful as well if a member of staff has been off, and I've been able to, just as a one-off lesson, be able to say, right, look at your pupil learning checklist, go back to it, and let's see where the areas are that you're really struggling with, and let's see if you can find some examples of them in your book. And it's amazing how much the pupils, that just as a one-off lesson, just something a little bit different, as of being able to sort of plug a gap there for a member of staff who's been off. But it's actually, when we've done the personal learning checklist in a book look with an inspector, they've been able to see what the students have learned previously and how that's been reviewed. Obviously, the pupil voice that they will talk to the pupils, and they will ask them sometimes to take a book with them, and they might actually say, right, talk me through what your learning is, what's your best piece of work that you've done, and why. And when I've worked alongside inspectors in the times I've done many sort of in preparing for Ofsted inspections, I've worked alongside many inspectors, and I've always developed my own way of doing this, and I've got them sometimes to sort of say to me, which is your, to coin Mary Myatt, what's your most beautiful piece of work? And it's always been great for the kids to be able to find something in there that will help them break the ice. And so it's very interesting for them to talk about their work. There will be that triangulation then with the work sampling, what they see in lessons, and talking to the staff and the pupils. It's very rare they give feedback. If you want to hang around after the first day or the second day, I'm sure they will give you that if you want. But it's always very brief. There are no gradings, as we know now, thankfully. And it's usually, it's usually, oh, that was fine, or this, that, and the other. That's the type of feedback that I've been hearing about. You may not be asked for any formal documentation, any policies or anything. So again, don't expect to have to produce reams of paperwork. The next thing is what they are keen to see. They're keen to see your key concepts and your knowledge and how you present that. How do the pupils commit it to long-term memory, not just memorising it? So in other words, how you actually are going through and refocusing on that, how you are actually retrieving it, how you're actually learning and spacing out the learning, how you're actually coming back to it, and in what way are you doing that? They're looking about how you're building on the new knowledge and the skills, and if that's building on what's been taught, and what are your intended endpoints of that particular program of study, or that particular year group or term or whatever. They're looking at how assessment is used to check understanding, and that it's not disconnected from your teaching, so it's not bolt on, it's part of that, it's the formative assessment. You know, your short low stakes quiz, low and high stakes quizzing. If you've still got students working from home or staff working from home, how is that integrated into the course? And where does a particular lesson fit into the sequence of teaching? If they see a lesson, they may well say to you, how does that fit in? What's coming next? And also, how does that help with the transition to the next stage? And then obviously they're going to want to know about the SEND pupils that they have in that group, and can they access the same flow and pace of knowledge, and have any groups been disapplied? And that's a tricky one, because that's something that you probably will not have had any sort of chance to say, no, I don't want that to happen. You might well have tried it, but it might be the head teacher's decision to disapply groups, to give them extra literacy or math, extra numeracy. And again, you might have to sort of think carefully about who you can point to them to speak to about that. Again, these are all questions that you may be asked as well. So going back to what I said earlier, there is quite a bit of overlap in the three sections. So from that, I just wanted to quickly, and again, I'll share any resources tonight quite freely and happily. This was a curriculum intent implementation and impact statement that I did when I was working as senior director for a very large trust in the north of England, which I did for 5 years as senior director. This was taken from all sort of different documents, from national curriculum, from you name it. I read it to put this together, and that was our philosophy of our pedagogy, enrichment and other general principles. And I do believe they're still using that now, even though I left at the back end of, well, I left to start with LanguageNet in January of this year. This is an example of a scheme of work that that you might have with your knowledge and the skills your enhancement broken down into 6 half terms for year 7. This was the teams that I worked with last year when we did our overarching curriculum review. We wrote our learning journeys for all of the pupils in year 7 to 11. This was an example of term 1 of year 7. And again, that was what we used at the beginning of each lesson, so the pupils knew exactly where they were in the journey. And this was one for Spanish. And then this is, we had a learning journey from year 7 to 11. We didn't call it Key Stage 3 to Key Stage 4. We kept it going as a 5-year course. Okay, and these are examples of learning checklists, which you can see here for year 7 and for year 8. A little bit more tricky with year 8 because we've gone into some sort of memorisation strategies and how they can help themselves to learn in terms of, and then obviously describing a photo based upon the current GCSE, that's what they have to do. So we kind of brought that in at a quite an early stage to get them to recognise what was important from that stage onwards. Okay, so we'll move on to the second section now on how you might prepare for a deep dive. This section is looking at how you might, not should, prepare. The preparation is everything, and preparation to your questions is key. Obviously, some people have said to me in passing, well, can we have a narrative for questions? Well, a narrative to questions, if you learn a narrative off by heart, you're going to come a cropper. So as long as you know your department really well, there's nothing wrong with taking some notes in with you and just having a few key words on there if that's what you feel will help you to get through it, particularly if you're a new head of department, or particularly if you are a head of department who has started to move through to a new curriculum, because there's all sorts of things. We all share resources on Twitter and Facebook. There's all sorts of new sort of methodologies out there. People do hybrid courses. You might use a textbook. You might follow a particular style of teaching. Whatever. In that case, then, if you're bringing a new curriculum in, then having some sort of keynotes as to how it's going to move forward and what you're expecting to happen may well be something that might help you in that discussion. It's important to remember that it's not just you, it's another department as well. So if you know that that head of department has had their deep dive on the first day and you haven't had your discussion, then go and see them after the first day and see what they were asked. That might just give you an insight into what you're going to get asked. As soon as you know that you're being inspected, try and find out from your head if your inspector or one of the inspectors on the team is a linguist, and in any case find out what the skills are on the inspection team, because that will give you an idea as to what kind of things to expect in terms of what questions you might get asked. First impressions do count, so what's on your website about your department, if you can update that with your schemes or with anything at all that's going on in the department, however mundane you think that is. It could be some screenshots of your pupils' work, it could be just a shot of some of the back of the heads of pupils doing some work, or it could be just a screenshot of the teacher's PowerPoint or whatever it is you use on your whiteboard. It just gives you a presence on that website, should we say, rather than nothing. And also make sure everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet. Know what your action plan looks like and how that feeds into the school one. And also, if your line manager and your SLT, do they know what's going on in languages? And also in some schools, you might have a link governor that is linked to your department that will then, hopefully, if they're brought in, they will have an idea as well as to what's going on. Obviously, give you some thought as to what joint observations you've done in your team, any work scrutiny and pupil voice you've got, and make sure that everybody knows what the pupil voice is saying about the department. Know what your key goals are and your priorities, anything that you're working on and how are you working towards that. Just solid good practice, really. But also remember, like I said at the beginning of this slide, that your curriculum development is not just that destination. If you're still bringing it in, that's fine, because you can't just bring it in lock, stock and barrel. You might only just bring it in with year 7 and then move it to year 8, or you might only still be bringing in, you might only be through to halfway through. I think it's important to be honest about that and make sure that your inspector's aware of what's coming and how that's going to progress. the school policy may well be to have an Ofsted ready file, and I was working the beginning of this year. I worked with a couple of heads of department in a schools near to where I live, who were getting ready for a deep dive, and they'd been given Ofsted ready files by their head teachers, and they were panicking because they didn't have the data and stuff to put in it. Well, often schools get you to have an Ofsted ready file. It's more like a comfort blanket, and they expect you to have an Ofsted narrative. It's something that it was in fashion at one time with Ofsted, that you had to have a file that you had to show the inspector and you had to go through it. They're not really that interested nowadays, but if your school wants you to have one, then I guess then that's what you have to do. If anybody wants to have an Ofsted ready file checklist, I've got one that I can send out, because I've had a few of those in the past that I've had to put together. One thing that I have done every time I've been involved in a deep dive is that I've had a list of these things, and one of them is, well, the only thing really, is the thing that's linked directly to Ofsted, and that is how many students are in years 11 to 9, how many kids are doing languages, and what that percentage is, because you can show then an upward trend. If you can show that upward trend, you are then moving in the right direction. They're not going to be giving you too much of a hard time, and the school will be, they will be actually obviously praised for that the EBAC numbers are going up with languages. If you're using a commercial scheme of work, like I said earlier, or a hybrid, or you've written your own and you've ditched every textbook, or you're picking cherry picking from different textbooks, you obviously can say, this is what we're doing, we're following this scheme of work from these textbooks, but we need to be adapted to suit our pupils, because that's one of the things that not a lot of schools, or schools that I've worked in or worked alongside, or I've had to go in and help them to sort of get themselves on track, or whatever guys I've gone in on. There are still some schools out there that go, right, today we're on page 7, let's follow this regardless of what. It's really important that you give that some thought to tailoring the curriculum to what your students need, because every student in every school is different. I've mentioned already about following your school policies with regard to things like that I mentioned there, because you don't want to let the side down. Tidy rooms are obviously, that goes without saying, and sharing all with the people in your school that are involved with languages, the strategies for supporting pupils with knowing and remembering more, because that's what Ofsted are so nuts about at the moment. Okay, talk to your students and ask them how they remember things. Discuss that in class. What are they learning, why are they learning, and how is it happening? Cultural capital rears its head occasionally, and we do that all the time in languages, but what does enrichment look like in languages? Are you doing anything to enrich the curriculum, and what is it? Be honest and identify what you're working on, and if you feel that you need to challenge anything that they're saying to you, or you need some evidence, or some explanation or evidence, then ask for it or give it, so that you're not going to leave yourself vulnerable. If there's something that you feel you've not said after the meeting, then go and find them and say, I just want to tell you this, because that will just then, we can't all be 100% on the ball in that half hour or 40 minutes, whatever time you've got. So don't be frightened to go back and challenge something or say something to them afterwards. Again, these are some questions that you might want to ask yourself, but again, you may well be asked these questions, and it's all about things we've mentioned, about how clear are you about the rationale about your own curriculum and the way it's being implemented. Is it being implemented in the way it's meant to be? And you'll see that through your observations. And how do you know this? And if not, how can you address this? And do you know what's being covered? Having said that, they're not going to say to you, they're not going to sit and say, right, when do you cover the past historic in French, or when do you cover subordinate clauses in German? It's just being able to talk about what you're covering and when you're covering it, in terms of, well, here's the scheme of work, this is what we do, and this is how it looks. Again, if you follow some of the more well-known schemes of work, they're all covered in there. If you follow some of the ones that are newer, again, there are all sorts of different ideas out there. So whatever ideas you're using, you will find that they're either on the website of the actual company whose resources they are, or whether it's you're following NSELP or Oak or any of the other companies, you will always be able to ask them if they've got any sort of teaching themes that will tell you what the concepts are and the themes and when they're taught in the order that they're taught. So that's useful to have if you are in a meeting and you need to just have it quickly. Again, I've talked about being relevant for your pupils. Do the staff know what they're doing? Obviously, I'm sure every member of staff in your department is going to be a really good linguist, but you may well be in a position like I was at a few times where we had someone in the department who only had an A level, and how are you supporting that non-specialist? And obviously, are you addressing any gaps in the learning, and is it working, and how do you know that it's working? It's really important you don't have any surprises, like I said on the previous one. How do you assess and track the knowledge? How do you measure the progress in your own mind? And what does progress actually look like in languages? What actually does it look like when a student is making progress? Obviously, your different groups of learners, how do you adapt the pedagogy for those? Think about that. And what are your strengths and areas for development? And how do you, one of the biggest questions that I always was scared of getting asked in my previous job was, how do you ensure coverage of the national curriculum if you do a 2-year Key Stage 3? Because I remember one or two schools were inspected, and they were literally said, well, how do you do that? And so we sort of said, well, you know, we do this because our curriculum is ambitious, it's enriched, we cover lots of different high frequency words, we cover lots of different important regular recycling of high frequency verbs, and I used to call them the martini verbs. If you're as old as I am, anytime, any place, anywhere, they were our top 20 verbs that we used to use, and we used them in every theme and topic that we did. The key things that I found useful in my last deep dive were one of the schools that I was working in had been in a category, they'd been in requires improvement, and they were being inspected again within the same framework of 2019. So I had made a real sort of effort to gather any evidence that I'd got from the progress from the last inspection made on the framework, and so that I kind of put together ready for the meeting with the man, and he never came to talk to me about it, which I was a bit annoyed about, but never mind, it was worth it in my mind doing it just in case. Obviously, they don't accept any internal data. They like to know what you're doing for your assessment and how that informs teaching, but they certainly won't look at your tags from the last 2 years, because obviously things have been very different, and hopefully going forward the results will be different this year because the exams are taking place. But obviously I've always found that things from pupil voice, I've had those on the walls in the classroom, I've had them on the corridors to say what the students say about the department. I've always thought, right, how does it feel to be a member of a teaching group? And it's just about good solid teaching, really. What's on the website, and again, I won't go through the rest of that because I think we've looked at that already and I've mentioned most of that. So let's move on. So I don't think we need to look at that one, but the pupil voice questions here, I've put on this slide and the next slide 2 slides of questions that pupil voice might come up in the pupil voice, which I know have been asked in recent ones. So again, I've got these in a big list. If you wanted them after the meeting, you're more than welcome to have them. These ones are quite interesting though, because they've really now started to focus on, how do you know how to pronounce a word? How do you know how to improve your pronunciation? Are you good at this? How do you know you're good at it? And how they learn and remember verbs, and how they learn and remember vocab. So we're moving on very quickly to the final session. And again, anything that I cover tonight that I go through, you're more than welcome to have. I won't say that again because I'm repeating myself. So these are the categories in which a lot of the questions that I've put together tonight actually fall into. And what I've done is I've ordered the questions in this sequence of ordering. So obviously, again, I'll reiterate, I've had some amazing support with putting this together. I've attended quite a few sessions myself, and it's been great to be able to put some answers in here that have been in previous training sessions. So again, thanks to colleagues who've helped with that. This is the biggie, isn't it? How do you decide, determine, talk me through your curriculum and all of that. So here we've got some types of answers that you could or you may not use. It's all about looking at the broad and ambitious curriculum, and it's about being based on national curriculum. It's all about being ambitious and moving towards that upward trend of pupils, and whatever your particular focuses, your ambition in your school. You're enriching them with the key skills. And then obviously here we've got some of the jargon that they're looking for. What's really interesting is in that research document that was published in June, there is no mention of skills. It's all about modalities: listening, reading, speaking, writing. So I've put that in brackets just so that you're aware of that, because I think sometimes if you've not had time to read stuff, and that's, like I said, I've got the luxury of being able to do that and to actually cascade this to you tonight, then at least you've kind of seen it and you're aware of it. So again, all about the phonics and the grammar, the memory retrieval and the spaced learning. I never called it high frequency. I always called it minimum critical learning. So in other words, what's the minimum critical stuff that my pupils need to get through a GCSE? And it's about 852 words on the current spec, I think, to be able to get through that. Obviously, if you provide any extracurricular activities that can go into the curriculum, you're also looking at pupils' cultural awareness and diversity. And if you've also got some other students who speak other languages, don't forget to include them about the fact, you know, that they talk about their lives and countries in the lessons, even though they don't speak French, German, Spanish, whatever it is you're teaching. You've got them in the lesson. They actually are there to support and to kindle the curiosity of other students to learn languages other than English. And when I was in a meeting, I always encouraged my heads of department that I worked with to talk about their curriculum intent document, have that in front of you, because that is giving you some sort of help, and it just keeps you focused on what you're doing. How's the curriculum designed to help consolidate learning? You're going to be judged on the extent to which your curriculum is planned coherently and how it's sequenced, so that the knowledge builds up cumulatively and your skills towards the next stage in the learning, whether that be GCSE or whether it be moving on from that to A-level. But you've definitely got you've got the key skills in the content which you're revisiting throughout the year. You've got a spiral curriculum maybe that does it that way. You've certainly got building blocks built upon to securely understanding. You've got your AFL and your high and low stakes assessment. Again, you're not going to sit there and read that to the inspector, but that's just to give you some sort of ideas about what kind of things you could say. How do you sequence your curriculum? Well, this was an interesting article that I read last week about the sourdough bread model. And when I sat and read it, I thought, oh, this is an interesting way of, an interesting analogy. Because basically what you do when you take sour bread, you take the dough, you slice a bit off, you make the bread. And then as you move forward, you take that piece of dough that you sliced off, you slice another piece off from the second batch, and you put that into the third one. And you carry on interleaving and revisiting. So you're basically feeding forward your topics in a planned way, so that the pupils can, I suppose, retrieve what they've studied in the past, and it helps them to remember more and more. And the key thing here, which is in the final question on this page, is why have you chosen to teach what you teach and when you teach it? Is this meaningful learning here? This is what they're looking for, the meaningful learning. Okay, so it's about being relevant, about being useful. Obviously, languages are really tricky to teach because of the fact that, you know, we don't speak them here in England. So you're constantly, you're having to battle to teach sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes you do. So giving them that positive experience is what you do. And I've put the term gradation in brackets because that's what's used in the research document. I've taken quite a few of these questions from people that I've run this session and added my own. But that was one of the questions that comes from that research document. Obviously your phonics and your verbs. Do you plan which words you cover every week? Again, if you're running certain themes, you might do that. But you're definitely going to be constantly analysing and adapting the course that you teach. Because that's what we do as teachers. We're constantly refreshing what we do. So it's a live document. Okay. In what ways does the curriculum deepen pupils' understanding? Well, obviously you're teaching high frequency verbs and concepts that can be used across lots of different contexts, and you regularly, hopefully, spacing the recycling and the retrieval to support the storing of that knowledge in your long-term memory. And obviously evaluation of your curriculum, you're constantly doing that in your meetings with your pupil voice. You'll be doing all your numbers are increasing, and obviously your in-house quality assurance systems will be doing that as well. Then we move on to progress. And this is really mainly about what are the main issues that are affecting any progress being made. So what's your biggest barrier in languages? Obviously, this will be personal to your department, but it's being constantly adapted to your scheme of work. So if you know, for example, that your students are struggling with listening, which a lot of students do, there's loads of really great resources out there now to try and combat that. And if you're a school that uses iPads and computers all the time, there's tons of stuff out there to do that with. But you might not have that. So you constantly still, you are the font of our knowledge in the classroom, pressing that button. So that might be something that you're working on, and you've got to be able to talk the talk and work your way around that. What does progress look like in your lesson? Obviously, increasing the spontaneity and the accuracy, knowing more, remembering more, and being able to do more are very key to Ofsted. That's what they're all about at the moment. They're all about being able to know more, remember it, and being able to do more by applying what they've learned to move forward. On this slide, I've also put some other questions, but because of the time scale that we've got of an hour, I haven't actually answered those. But again, if you wanted me to go through them and do that, I can. I've got the answers to them, and I can send that document out without any trouble. Again, this is not how you definitely answer them. This is how you may answer them, and it might give you some food for thought to think, do you know what, I've thought about that. I'm not going to answer it using those words, but I've given me some food for thought to how I'm going to answer it. This was a big one that was in the training that Helen Myers did. How do you plan for progression in the 3 pillars of phonics, vocab and grammar? And that's very linked, very heavily stacked against one type of teaching, from novice to expert. Sorry about that, expert. It's built into your scheme of work, obviously, but it's interesting, isn't it? How would you define a novice and an expert? Because you might, I remember going back a few years, my head teacher used to say, well, are they not a level 7 yet? And when it was old national curriculum levels, and I go, no, they're still a level 3. But why are they not a level 7? Because they're not a level 7 across the board. They might be a level 7 in knowing a particular discrete part of, one defined clear set of words. But when it comes onto a new topic, then they're back at a novice again. So the definition of a novice is really novice you have to actually explicitly teach to help them to become better at what they're doing. And the expert, really, I suppose, is somebody who's much more keen to go and find the answer for themselves, and is really sort of more inquiry-based learning, if that's the way that you teach. Okay, so again, talking about how you plan for progression in making sure that the students can speak clearly and reliably. Again, this is going to depend on your situation. If you follow the national curriculum and the GCSE course, there's not going to be any strict order of introducing the words. You obviously adapt the words that you teach. You might get the students to look up a word, as was mentioned at our question time event in June. You don't just stop prevent them from learning it. You say, right, if this is a word that's important to you, then go and look it up, or I'll give you this word. But if you've got the wherewithal of being able to pronounce it, then you've more chance of the child being more motivated to look for that. You might liaise with your primary schools to see how they teach English phonics, and to reinforce that good practice. If you've got a few number of primary schools that feed into yours, you might use a standalone course, for example, the ones I've mentioned there, and that's just spattered through your scheme of work. You might decide to use something a little bit more adventurous than that. It might be something that you might not even teach phonics at the moment, but it's something I certainly would think about strongly looking into, because it is obviously very important at the moment. You might draw the attention to the words when they come up and deliberately compare them to other patterns, and also I'm sure you give extensive experience while looking at transcripts and songs and chants. So again, those are all sort of ways in which you can plan for progression, in making sure that they can do it clearly and reliably. How can you draw attention to the importance of pronunciation? And I couldn't resist here to plug our new phonics area, which is up and running. Well, it should be up and running by next week, certainly. It's basically done. It's ready. It's with the dev team, and I think they're checking it at the moment. So again, if you wanted to subscribe to Language Nut just for a free trial, you can always contact us and have a look at our new phonics area. But we also have lots of other activities that are on our exam skills and on our all our learn, practice, quiz sections. But certainly going back to those of us that can remember a sympathetic native speaker, I've marked for the GCSE boards and A-level boards for many years, and it was always about the sympathetic native speaker. If they can understand that, then you need to celebrate and reward it. You know, we're not asking for perfection, and it's that way you will never get students being reluctant to have a go. You're not going to overly correct them, and you're always sensitive when you do that. And I'm sure lots of us are aware of the NSELP approach of presenting contrasting minimal pairs. You look at them and you teach them as you go through, and you also encourage students, once they know a little bit about pronunciation, to work out the pronunciation of their own words and see if they can have a go at themselves, and you encourage them to record themselves speaking, which again Language Nut can help you with if you are interested. When we get on to vocab, how do you select the vocab and the verbs you teach? Well, there again, it's going to depend on the course that you run, but they're both essential for communication. And obviously, you will decide which ones you teach and when you teach them based upon your scheme that you run and the topics that you teach, which are relevant for your students. And obviously, you will have the minimum critical words, the high frequency words that will be commonly able to be used across different scenarios. And how you teach the ones that are not high frequency, again, will depend very much upon the course that you use. It could well be that your pupil engagement is important to you, so therefore you are sticking to the vocab that you think your students would value the most. But obviously, we're all guided by the National Curriculum and the GCSE requirements. National Curriculum does not have a prescriptive list of vocab and grammar, but GCSE certainly does. And again, I've put on the side here on our website, we have the most common verbs in our grammar section that you can use and reuse with different concepts. Again, possible questions on vocabulary. How do you ensure that they can use these words across different topics? One of the things I've always done is make sure that I've explained a word. For example, Geschichte in German means history and story, and we've always looked at the words and the different meanings so they can then understand it in a different context. If they're learning history at school or they're reading a story in their free time. Again, spacing your repetition. One of the things that I've done on Language Nut is I've created loads of tests when I've been teaching weeks 1 to 30, and I've said to the students in my class, right, I want you to go on, I want you to look at week 6, and there's been a random list of vocab that I know we've covered, and the students have gone on and they've practiced it, and they've practiced it, then they've gone on to week 7, then week 8, and then I've said, right, I want you to go back to week 6. That way they're doing it for 5 minutes a week, sometimes 10 minutes, depending upon their own time that they have available. And they've been able to go over and over the vocab that they've met. Keeping words in long-term memory. Remember, that's important to Ofsted at the moment. Less is more philosophy is very common because you can't keep revisiting all the words, otherwise you'd never teach anything. So retrieving and recalling and quizzing is regular, giving examples of when you do that. You might use that as homework and starters and so on. Your students might have knowledge organisers or whatever it is you use. You might have an elaborate electronic tracking system. Certainly on Language Note, we can help you with that in our admin area, where we can show you what each student has learned, how much vocabulary they've picked up, and how much grammar they've done. And obviously, how do you secure a deepen understanding when you teach a key concept? It's about not overloading the working memory. And I think that's, again, is something that's key to mention in your conversation, that you're aware of that, because that's important in terms of the learning that your students do. Do you actually teach vocab that they can use and understand? Well, again, that's something to think about. And again, this thing about mastery, how do you think strategically about developing them there? So obviously, you don't limit the words you teach. You may limit the words you teach. I don't know. It depends what you do, but it's about the relevance. Now, I'm conscious of the time that we've got 8 minutes to go, so I'm just going to purposefully let you have a quick sight of some of these grammar things in case anybody is wanting to watch this again, and you can pause it and see roughly what the answers are, the suggested answers to some of the questions that are on these slides. So stopping at assessment here, how do you approach error correction? It's interesting when I was doing the research for this and over the last sort of 12 months really, how the vocab has changed in the inspection framework. Error correction, I'd never seen that before. And also this statement, the third bullet point down about recasting. Recasting is restating what the pupil said but correcting errors in it. Again, you'll find that in the research document, but I'm just sort of alerting you to the fact that it's important to think about how you actually approach the error correction. Obviously, you know, you might do it as a focus correction. You're not going to absolutely decimate a child's work by underlining every single mistake. That would be so soul destroying for that child. So obviously that's something to think about in terms of that. Intervention, obviously I've not done any answers for that for sake of time. But again, showing what the interventions you put in place. Interventions are obviously something that we all do with all year groups, particularly year 11. Obviously CPD, these are more general questions about what CPD you've had and what impact it's had on your quality of teaching and learning in the department. And also SEND. And something I wanted to point out to you tonight is something I came across earlier this week in someone's deep dive questions about how do you support SENK children in languages? I've never come across that K before. And I rang someone today who I know works in SEN, and they said to me the K refers to neurological, genetic or medical needs. And I think if you look that up, it does actually state that. But just to be aware, if they actually ask you SENK, that's what that means. Obviously, it's about supporting your disadvantaged learners, your pupil premiums with your scaffolding, and how do you cater for the more able in MFL with your stretch and challenge. And then your workload, again, they're going to ask you about that, aren't they? About what do you do if someone's absent? What do SLT think about your department? And also, you know, do the effect help you with teacher workload? And this is one of the things that they might say to you as you run into a lesson with them. You know, what am I going to see today in this lesson? How's this going to see? What's the teaching assistant going to be doing? What's the FLA going to be doing? They want to know that you know what's going to happen in the member of staff's lesson that they're going to go and see with you. And again, I talked about having the assessments, about the low and high stake assessments throughout the year. And I cannot believe that with 5 minutes to go, even though I've missed out probably about 6 slides, but I've gone through them and you're welcome to have them, that I've come to the end of that session. So I'm going to hand back to Zoe now. Zoe, have we got any questions on the...
We've got lots of questions and lots of really lovely feedback as well. Thank you so much to all the people who've been saying how helpful this is, and we're really grateful for that.
That's great.
Got a few questions. So one question, I don't have the name of this person, but they were told by their school that there are no more lesson observations.
Maybe that's true then. I don't know. That's not what I've heard.
I mean, every teacher you've spoken to has had lessons observed.
Yeah,
right?
up until last Friday, every teacher I've seen has definitely had an observation.
Okay, so unless something has changed this week to that person, then there are lesson observations. Yeah. And
if it has changed, I apologise because I didn't know about that.
The only thing I can think of is that obviously there are no grades for individual lessons anymore. So I'm wondering whether there's been a miscommunication there. People think it could because individual teachers don't get graded on their lessons by Ofsted.
No.
Maybe that's a misunderstanding on the school, but I would speak to your school and see about that. There's a question from Mrs. Kauser who has asked about what do you suggest in small schools where there is no lead for MFL?
That's probably going to be down to the SLT, who is part of looking after that area, or if it falls under English, it could well be that. There must be somebody in that school who has who's in charge of saying, right, that's okay for a scheme of work. So again, I think I would go back to the SLT and say, right, who is going to be fronting this if this happens, and asking that question.
Great. Thanks. And I think one last question from Emily H. And she says, thanks for all the information. She feels much more confident now. She teaches A-level. Are there many differences compared to what you've been presenting so far?
Not really. It's just good good teaching, isn't it? It's just good solid teaching, because A-level teaching is no different to the rest of what you just have. Smaller classes, hopefully more switched on children, more keen students. But no, I've always taught the same type of lesson to sixth form as I have to the lower down the school. It might not be as like singy dancy and doing lots of actions, although some students at A-level learn through that. But no, it's not really any different in terms of what you expect.
Great. That's really great. So the questions that have come through, people have been asking about the recordings and the PowerPoint and so on. Yeah. So as Elaine mentioned, we will send the recording out as soon as we can, and it will be available on our website. And the easiest thing is actually if you just pause it at the PowerPoint that you want. But if anybody does want any resources, the PowerPoint or any particular, some people have been asking about the personal learning checklist, for example, please email Elaine at languagenut.com. You can see hers at the bottom there. And I'm sure Elaine is so generous with her resources, like many people in the profession. So I'm sure you have to send that. If you are interested in LanguageNut and you'd like to have a free trial, please email Daniel at languagenut.com or any of us. But obviously that's not something that you have to do in order to attend our webinars. We do this because we feel it is really, really important, and it's our duty as people involved in the education sector. Thanks very, very much to everybody, and thank you again for your feedback. Please do let us know what you thought, if there's anything you'd like to see, and please direct your colleagues in primary to the Ofsted webinar in 2 weeks' time with Ellie Chettle-Cully. And I think that's everything. Thanks very much.
Thank you, and hope it's been useful.